Darius stepped off the bus with a duffel bag, a 5-year-old gripping his hand, and a war he never really left behind. No welcome home. Just quiet stares from a neighborhood that suddenly felt smaller. Bills were waiting. The house was falling apart. His son was watching everything. Then his white neighbor crossed the street and said one sentence, out loud, clear enough for others to hear. It wasn't kind. It wasn't cruel. But it stopped Darius cold. Because in that moment, he realized surviving the war might have been easier than surviving home. So what do you do when one sentence exposes everything you've been hiding? Drop a comment and tell us what you think that sentence was. Subscribe now. This story only gets heavier from here. Darius moved through each day with military precision, not because life was orderly, but because chaos waited for any pause. He woke before sunrise, fixed what he could with what little he had, and focused on one rule that had kept him alive overseas. Don't stop moving. Coming home hadn't turned that rule off. If anything, it made it louder. Darius Coleman wasn't adjusting to civilian life, he was enduring it. His son watched quietly. Malik learned early how to stay out of the way, how to read a room before speaking, how to disappear without leaving. Teachers noticed before neighbors did. Linda Reynolds, his classroom teacher, called it withdrawn, but the drawings told more than words ever could. Small figures boxed into tight spaces, no doors, no windows. When she asked if everything was stable at home, the question landed heavier than it sounded. Darius answered the way he always did. Short, controlled, final. Family pressure didn't help. Sharon Coleman believed in practicality, not patience. She reminded him the house was failing, the money was thin, and pride didn't keep lights on. She talked about selling, about starting over somewhere easier. What she didn't see was that easier often meant disappearing, and Darius had already done enough of that. Outside the family, the pressure was colder. Richard Hawthorne had been buying up properties on the block, circling homes like numbers on a spreadsheet. Offers came wrapped in politeness but carried the same message: move or be moved. The neighborhood noticed who was being approached first. And then there was the neighbor across the street. Emily Carter didn't say much, but when she looked at Darius, she didn't look past him. That alone felt dangerous. Nothing had exploded yet. No confrontation, no accusation. But every part of Darius's life was tightening at once, and the silence around him wasn't empty. It was waiting. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through routines, through silence, through moments that felt small until they stacked into something heavy enough to crush. Darius felt it every morning when he walked Malik to school, and every evening when he unlocked a house that seemed to sag a little more each day. The neighborhood watched, not openly, not aggressively, just enough to remind him he was being measured. At school, Malik's silence deepened. He stopped bringing drawings home. He stopped asking questions. When Darius sat across from the school desk, the air felt tight, polite, and cold. The concern wasn't framed as blame, but it carried weight all the same. "Your son needs more structure than you're provident." The words landed hard, not because they were shouted, but because they assumed failure before understanding. Darius nodded, jaw locked, knowing how easily concern could turn into judgment when patience ran out. Outside the school, the neighborhood shifted. Flyers appeared on doors, cars slowed near the curb. Richard's influence moved quietly but efficiently, pressing in on homes that looked tired, families that looked vulnerable. One afternoon, a man in a clean jacket stopped Darius near the porch, smiling like this was business as usual. "You need to decide. This house isn't yours to hold." The smile didn't soften the threat, it sharpened it. Malik stood behind his father, small fingers curled into Darius's jacket, absorbing every word. At home, the walls felt thinner. Sharon called more often, her voice carrying urgency masked as concern. "The math didn't lie," she said. "The house needed money they didn't have. The world wasn't built for patience." Darius listened without responding. Every suggestion sounded like surrender dressed up as wisdom. Then came the night everything slipped. It started with a sound that shouldn't have mattered, a sharp crack somewhere down the street. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. The room tilted. Air thinned. His hands shook as memories rushed in uninvited, loud and relentless. He dropped to the kitchen floor, back against the cabinet, fighting to stay present. He didn't realize Malik was there until it was too late. The boy stood frozen in the doorway, eyes wide, watching his father struggle against something invisible but overwhelming. No blood, no noise. just fear settling into a place it didn't belong. Dadar. You okay? The question cut deeper than any accusation. Darius forced himself upright, steadying his voice, sending Malik back to bed. But the damage lingered. The next morning, whispers followed him down the street. A passing voice carried just enough venom to sting. Figures. They can't handle normal life. No one claimed it. No one corrected it. The silence around it felt intentional. Emily watched from across the street, arms folded, eyes sharp. She didn't step in. Not yet. Darius avoided her gaze, ashamed of being seen cracked, exposed, human. The sentence she'd spoken days earlier echoed louder now, refusing to fade. By the end of the week, the pressure converged. School concern, housing threats, family demands, and a child learning that safety could disappear without warning. Darius stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the walls Malik used to trace with his fingers, realizing survival had started costing more than it saved. Emily crossed the street that evening, her voice carrying without hesitation. This is what happens when people expect you to break quietly. The words didn't comfort him. They challenged him. And for the first time, Darius understood something terrifying. Holding everything in wasn't protecting his son. It was teaching him how to disappear. And if nothing changed soon, the silence would finish what the war had started. The moment didn't arrive with warning. It came stacked on top of exhaustion, fear, and weeks of pressure that had nowhere left to go. Darius stood on the front steps just after sunset, the porch light flickering like he couldn't decide whether to stay on. Malik was inside, quiet in a way that no child should have to learn. The house felt smaller now, boxed in by eyes that watched and systems that waited. A black sedan rolled to a stop at the curb. Clean, confident, unrushed. Richard stepped out like the street already belonged to him, clipboard tucked under one arm, smile practiced enough to feel permanent. He didn't bother with greetings. This is your last notice. Take the offer or you lose everything. The words landed hard, loud enough for nearby windows to glow faintly as curtains shifted. This wasn't business anymore. It was pressure meant to humiliate, meant to remind Darius that patience only existed for people with leverage. The threat wasn't shouted, but it was public, and that made it worse. Darius felt something give, not break. Shift. All the nights on the kitchen floor. All the mornings Malik watched him pretend he was fine. All the silence he'd swallowed to keep the peace. He stepped forward, chest tight, voice no longer controlled. You don't get to decide when my life ends. The street went still. Richard's smile faltered just enough to reveal surprise. That wasn't part of the script. Darius had never raised his voice before. Not here. Not anywhere that mattered. A car door slammed behind them. Sharon had arrived unannounced, urgency written across her face. She took in the scene in seconds. The man, the clipboard, the tension vibrating in the air. Her voice cut through sharply, fear dressed as reason. This pride is going to cost your son everything. The sentence stung because it came from love twisted by panic. Malik stood at the edge of the hallway, unseen by most, absorbing every word. This was the inheritance Darius had been fighting without realizing it, the lesson that survival meant surrender. Then Emily stepped onto the sidewalk. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice at first. She looked at Richard, then at Sharon, then finally at Darius, not with pity, with recognition, the kind that refuses to look away. You're not watching a negotiation. You're watching a man be pushed because you expect him to stay quiet. The sentence hit harder than any threat. Phones appeared. A neighbor froze halfway across the street. The air shifted. This wasn't private anymore. It wasn't contained. The system depended on moments like this staying invisible. Richard tried to regain control, adjusting his stance, clearing his throat, but something had slipped. Authority loses power the second it has to explain itself. Inside the house, Malik moved before anyone could stop him. Small feet, steady steps. He came to stand beside his father, eyes locked forward, voice trembling but clear. Stop talking to my dad, like that. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They cut through the moment with terrifying clarity. A child had stepped into a space adults had filled with fear and calculation, and suddenly every excuse sounded hollow. Darius felt it then, the full weight of the choice in front of him. Silence or presence, endurance or truth. He placed a hand on Malik's shoulder, grounding himself, grounding his son. Whatever happened next would be seen. And that was the point. The street stayed quiet. No one spoke. No one moved. Because the power had shifted, not with force, not with rescue, but with refusal. And once that kind of truth is spoken out loud, there's no pulling it back. The street didn't explode into justice. No apologies were handed out. No system suddenly corrected itself. What changed was quieter and heavier. The pressure that once pushed Darius inward had been exposed, and once something is seen, it never fully disappears again. The offers stopped coming the way they used to, not because power vanished, but because it had been forced into the open. Neighbors who once watched from behind curtains now looked directly at him, some with discomfort, some with respect. Silence had lost its protection. Inside the house, the shift was clearer. Malik slept differently. His shoulders weren't as tight. He stopped standing in doorways like he was waiting for permission to exist. The fear hadn't magically disappeared, but it no longer ran the room. For the first time since the war ended, Darius understood that strength wasn't what he'd been taught overseas. It wasn't control. It wasn't endurance. It was presence. He didn't rebuild the house overnight. The bills didn't stop. The world didn't soften. But something permanent had taken root. Malik Coleman had seen his father stand, not to fight, not to beg, but to refuse disappearance. That lesson would last longer than any threat ever could. Emily didn't become a savior. She became a witness. And that mattered, because injustice depends on moments staying unseen, unchallenged, and quickly forgotten. That night didn't allow that luxury. This wasn't a perfect ending. Racism doesn't end cleanly. It adapts. It waits. It hopes people will get tired and quiet again. But something had broken that pattern. Not loudly, but publicly. The real question isn't whether this happens. It's how often. How many people are still being pushed to endure instead of live? And how many moments like this pass without anyone willing to speak? If this story challenged you, let it do its work. Like the video, share it to keep the conversation moving. Tell us your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Black Community Struggles for stories that speak when others won't.